It's impossible to have any discussion about Final Fantasy VII without mentioning its importance in the industry, and in the history of all video games. If you want to know why Final Fantasy is still considered to be an important and big franchise here in the West, it can all be traced back to the 7th entry in the series. FF7's decision to use full 3D graphics for cutscenes and character models was considered the next major leap for this console generation, but it didn't try to iterate on the pre-established RPG formula that the series was very comfortable with. What FF7 instead had was a giant push for Western audiences that was handled primarily by Sony, as they were struggling against Nintendo and Sega's consoles at the time, and needed a big motivating push for the new PlayStation. Despite the series having been primarily associated with Nintendo's consoles, Sony's push for FF7, alongside with many other factors, led us to where we are today. The reason why Final Fantasy is a much bigger franchise here in the West compared to some other contemporaries like Dragon Quest, which is super popular in Japan, it's because of just how massive and popular FF7 was, acting as one of the landmark titles for the PlayStation. Don't get me wrong though, Final Fantasy VII was incredibly huge in Japan as well. It's hard to truly paint the importance and success of Final Fantasy VII. It was a defining title for its generation, with praise towards the characters, the world, and of course the music, composed by the legendary Nobuo Uematsu. Its success pushed the Final Fantasy series to where it is today, and despite how many new releases and spin-offs, FF7 will always hold this legendary status that few RPGs will ever achieve. It was so popular that it basically spawned its own spin-off franchise of extra games, films, novels, you name it, and you'll probably be able to find it within what's now referred to as the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. I don't have a nostalgic attachment to FF7. The first time I played it was back in 2019, and while I enjoyed the game and thought some aspects like the music and villain held up incredibly well, I didn't love the whole experience, and found points in the game where it lost my attention. I'd love to go back and revisit it someday, but I wanted to mention this so you knew where I'm coming from. There's a lot of die-hard fans of FF7, and I wouldn't consider myself one, but I can absolutely see why this game is so beloved, so keep my perspective of the original game in mind as we talk a little about the Final Fantasy VII Remake Trilogy. When the Final Fantasy VII Remake was announced in 2015, it was an incredibly big moment. Years of speculation and anticipation were finally paid off for so many fans. The excitement was crazy, and years of little information trickled by until the full unveiling of what the game would be and what to expect. It was during this lead-up that I remember hearing about the game being planned to be broken up into parts. At the time, I remember being a bit confused, because the first thing that I thought of were the Telltale games that were growing in popularity and had episodic releases. Were we going to get that with FF7 Remake? The whole story being broken up into chunks released yearly? Thankfully, that wouldn't be the case, but ironically enough, that idea was adopted later for Final Fantasy VII Ever Crisis. But that's a different story. Instead, what breaking the game up means is taking the entire story and game of Final Fantasy VII and expanding upon it in a way that would warrant creating 3 full-sized RPGs. It's not taking a game and separating it into 3 small chunks. It's taking a single game and expanding it into such a massive scale that it would be impossible and financially detrimental to create unless split into 3 games. I've seen comparisons of the FF7 Remake Trilogy being compared to the Hobbit films by Peter Jackson, taking a single source material and adding so much to it that it would stretch it out into 3 parts. This is the easiest comparison to make, but I wouldn't say it's entirely accurate. The original game clearly had big scope with the size of the world and environments, but technology limited a lot of things, and taking a mostly flat and empty overworld and fully realizing it into a living, explorable, fully interactive world that would honor the scope and intent of the original, that would always be a huge undertaking, regardless of the direction the developers would go with it. If you're unfamiliar, the Final Fantasy VII Remake Trilogy takes the original game and separates it like this, with the first game in the trilogy, appropriately titled Final Fantasy VII Remake, encompassing the first 5 hours of the original, but expanding on it. Remake was an entirely new game, not a visual upgrade. A completely new combat system, new scenes and missions that flesh out the characters that had minor roles in the original, and a story that follows most of the beats of the original, but with new moments that operate under the assumption that you've played the original. Don't let the name fool you. FF7 Remake isn't a faithful remake of the original, but the beginning to a brand new story that is meant for fans, recreating the story they thought they knew, but having brand new changes that are pretty earth-shattering for what the story is and what it will be. Final Fantasy VII Remake released on April 10th, 2020, but I didn't play it myself until about a year later. I like the game, and the highlights are what you can immediately see. The combat is flashy and fun, with enough depth to keep you engaged in strategizing like the original turn-based game. The visuals are pretty stellar, with well-realized environments, character models, animations, cutscenes. It's all top-tier stuff. The story is mostly enjoyable when it feels focused. When it gets bogged down in what I can only describe as filler, time-wasting mission design is when the game is at its worst. The ending of the game is like a cocaine disco RPG party and leaves some giant reveals for what the remake trilogy actually is. The story of Final Fantasy VII, but told in a way that the biggest moments of the original could potentially change, and the things you think are going to happen may not happen at all. I don't know much about the general fan reaction, but as someone who isn't strongly attached to the original, I liked what the possibilities could be, and how this new story creates an interesting subversion of expectations. Despite this being a story I was already familiar with, it was exciting to think that I still didn't know exactly how the story would play out, even if that meant getting bogged down in alternate timelines, alternate worlds, or whatever the hell Sephiroth is talking about.
7 seconds till the end. Time enough for you, perhaps.
That finally brings us to the big 150 gigabyte middle child elephant in the room. Expectations were high going into Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Remake only encompassed the first 5 hours of the original, which was a very linear setup for the story and characters. The true explorable world of Final Fantasy VII was saved for Rebirth, which was already big shoes to fill, not including the setup for the new story, where Remake ended on a cliffhanger regarding an important character for the story, and whose death in the original seemingly being rewritten in favor of doing something completely new. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth released a few months ago to critical acclaim. Currently on OpenCritic, it's the highest rated game of the year so far, sitting at a 93 average, if you're not including expansions or DLC like Shadow of the Erdtree. Critics lauded how Rebirth built off of the foundation of Remake to create a giant, expansive RPG with exciting combat, loads of missions to complete, secrets to discover, collectibles to find. Some claimed that it was a faithful and successful recreation of an already beloved world with so much more going on. So what did I think? I think many of the strengths of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth are shared with Remake. In fact, I have no trouble saying that if you enjoyed Remake, you'll probably like Rebirth just as much, if not more. The biggest outright compliment I can say for Rebirth is that it is definitely a bigger, more ambitious, and far more interesting title than the previous in this Remake trilogy. Like I said with Remake, visually speaking, Rebirth is pretty incredible. The world is beautiful with a lot of variety in the environments you'll explore. One of the most impressive things that stood out to me are the indoor environments. I can't even begin to imagine the amount of work and time spent on creating giant, complex indoor spaces with so many little details that'll go unappreciated, since many of these spaces you'll travel and walk through in just a few minutes, maybe even seconds. Whenever I stopped to just look around and appreciate the environmental art of Rebirth, I was regularly blown away. There were some player concerns regarding blurred visuals on the performance mode that runs at 60 frames, but sitting 6 feet from my TV, I got accustomed to it. And the 30 frame mode of the game felt a little too choppy and awkward for my liking, which was strange, since I played through the entirety of Final Fantasy XVI at 30 frames and thought it felt just fine. So your mileage on resolution and frames will vary, but I think 60 is the better choice for Rebirth. The strong visuals are highlighted well with the combat. All of the special attacks have dynamic camera angles that makes combat feel so much more visceral and exciting, with so many crazy effects that can sometimes make combat a bit hard to keep track of, but I think that Rebirth strikes a good balance between hectic and readable. For the most part, I never had too much trouble keeping track of what was happening, and all that exciting flavor in the visuals just led to this over-the-top feel that you'd be hard-pressed to find in a lot of games. You can tell that Rebirth had a giant budget, and thankfully that budget doesn't go to waste from a visual standpoint. This also extends to a lot of the cutscenes, which I thought had great camera work and pacing. The cinematic quality of Rebirth is a major highlight. The music is mostly delightful, ranging from beautiful orchestral renditions of the classic themes you'll recognize, to plenty of new tracks that you'll find yourself humming when you're not playing the game. There are some noticeable issues when it comes to the sheer size and scope of the soundtrack, but we'll touch on that a bit later. Some of my favorite songs that come to mind immediately are the theme to the Gongaga region.
Me? Gongaga.
And the theme song to the highly addicting card game you'll find in Rebirth, Queen's Blood. Speaking of Queen's Blood, when it comes to extras and side content, you'd be pretty hard-pressed to find an RPG that has more extra dumb bullshit to do, like card games, little strategy games, a shooting gallery, chocobo racing, another racing minigame, a dolphin racing minigame. You get the idea. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is packed to the brim with minigames and little bonus side content that'll keep you busy, outside of what I would consider to be the more substantial side content, like side missions, open-world explorable missions, and combat challenges. Your mileage may vary on the minigames and your enjoyment, but honestly, I really liked most of them, and I'd happily take the time to seek them out when I had new ones available. You can be handsomely rewarded with helpful items or magic spells, also known as materia, for getting the top scores in these games, which for the most part never was too challenging. And Queen's Blood is a super addicting good time. You can earn new cards by buying them at stores and beating other NPCs at Queen's Blood, and you can even find special challenges that require you to win under special conditions. Keep in mind that Queen's Blood isn't what I would call a very well-balanced card game. I would get my ass handed to me one game, and then for the rematch, I would completely stomp my opponent, all because of how the cards happen to be shuffled. Maybe it was just because of the deck I happen to have, so keep that in mind, but I regularly found myself winning difficult Queen's Blood games without changing my strategy or deck at all, and just waiting for the odds to favor my hand. It wasn't until some of the special challenges and the final NPC you play against in Queen's Blood that I found myself having to actually try new strategies to win. Queen's Blood isn't treated as just an optional little thing to do. It's also its own expansive questline that ended up being a pleasant surprise. On the topic of the typical side quests and open world activities, you know, the more traditional quests that have more character interactions and normal combat, these mostly range from okay to pretty enjoyable. Most of the open world activities are pretty simple collectibles and items to discover, usually leading to better equipment, items, materia, etc. The side missions are more interesting and are usually focused on Cloud and one other party member. Here you'll get a little more characterization for that specific party member. Some of the conversations they have with Cloud can be really sincere and offer a lot more depth for them, and sometimes they can be just plain silly or even downright funny.
Hey!
You needn't worry. Their newfound fear of the outside world has driven them home with all haste.
You speak chicken?
More or less.
You'll also find another special type of side quest in every region called the Regional Phenomenon, which, just like Queen's Blood, reveals itself as a long side quest that focuses on one overarching story that is slowly told as you complete these individual phenomenon quests. Here you'll also find some of the more interesting minigames, like the Fort Condor minigame. This questline was pretty intriguing all the way through, and although some of the individual phenomenon missions weren't particularly enjoyable, the culmination of the questline leads to a pretty enjoyable surprise, but I'll save more of my thoughts on that for the spoiler section of this video. With all those out of the way, let's dive into the two most important components of the game, the combat and the story. Combat has been expanded upon the original remake in a major way. The bulk of the strategy remains the same as before, using your different character attacks to build up your ATB gauge, which you then spend on abilities, magic, and items, reminiscent of the turn-based strategy of the original, but with an extra active action feel that reminds me mostly of Kingdom Hearts, but with a much crunchier punch to it. It's no surprise that even the design of the command menu is similar to Kingdom Hearts. Your total party members have been expanded from 4 to 7, with Red 13, Yuffie, and Cait Sith joining Cloud and the others on their journey to stop Sephiroth. Unlike Remake, for most of the game, you have full decision over which party members you want to take control of, just like the original. There are moments during the story where the party will be locked and chosen for you, which I actually really liked, as it's a nice change of pace that forces the player to adapt to a party they may not be familiar with, and try out new team synergies. And when I say synergies, I don't mean that in a metaphorical sense. The biggest new update to the combat is the inclusion of synergy skills and synergy abilities. Special abilities that can only be performed by specific party members depending on who's in the team. Tifa can use Cloud to propel herself into the sky. Aerith can use most party members to act as a bodyguard to shield herself from damage. Cloud can use a supercharged Magic Blade Bash for a powerful charged strike. We don't have just synergy skills, we also have synergy abilities. You can think of them almost like traditional limit breaks. Supercharged attacks between two characters with a killer animation, and a bonus effect like temporary unlimited magic or beefing up your limit breaks, which are of course the original character-specific special moves that are as destructive and useful as they are flashy. Building up your synergy abilities and using them at the right time are the key to winning tough fights, because of their useful effects and their ability to quickly stun tough enemies to give your team a chance to recover and deal damage. Beyond that, we also have improvements in aerial combat and new abilities for every party member. Customization in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is incredible and was actually pretty overwhelming at first, since you start the journey with 5 of the 7 party members. And not only can you use materia to build each character to your liking, but every character also has unique weapons that alter their stats, with no single weapon being significantly better than the other. If you want Cloud to focus on magic spells or physical attacks, or maybe a little bit of both, you'll have options to tailor your character to what you think works best. But that's not all. Each weapon for each character also comes with extra little customizable passive effects that can be used to further enhance a character. Do you want Yuffie and Cait Sith to focus on critical damage? Do you want Barret to be a full-on physical bruiser, or a complete tank that absorbs damage? Rebirth's customization options for combat are humongous, and that customization will serve you great with the combat challenges. As you explore the world, you'll discover special fights with specific monsters that will go towards unlocking special mini-boss fights in every region, as well as unlocking even more combat challenges. As you progress through the game, you'll unlock a healthy amount, and these combat challenges are the perfect testing ground for your characters and your capabilities. And unlike in the rest of the game, you can choose to swap Cloud out for these challenges. With that being said, I highly recommend outfitting Cloud with the Prey materia, which lets him do a free heal for the party after filling his ATB bar all the way. Since he's locked in the party for a majority of the journey, having him capable of doing a party heal without spending MP is a super useful tool. You'll also run across optional boss battles against the summons. Completing these will unlock the summons for you as temporary companions to use in battle, just like how they were in Remake. These fights are tough as nails, but thankfully the game offers a great option for difficulty. You can tone down the difficulty of the fight depending on how many of these summon crystals you'll find in the overworld. So if you're struggling with a summon fight and haven't found all the associated crystals, you can make it easier, which I would recommend doing anyways, because some of the toughest fights in the late game will be locked to you, unless you've found all the summon crystals, but we'll get to that later. The story is the real draw here, and thankfully, like most things in the game, it's a definite improvement over Remake. One of the obvious reasons why is simple. You have a lot more of the original source material to cover, so you can feel that the game's narrative isn't as padded out as it was in 2020. You're visiting so many more interesting locations, like the delightful beach town of Costa del Sol, or the grand amusement park of the Gold Saucer, with a host of minigames and fun challenges. The Gold Saucer is a major highlight in this game, especially just the visual design. Like I said before, the environments you'll visit, from a colorful amusement park to a dark, moody dungeon, it's all incredible. The characters also get a lot more moments to shine and grow, and the strength of them comes down to their chemistry and relationships together. The best scenes in the game are always between Cloud and another party member, and watching Cloud's journey towards opening up to and trusting his friends. If you're at all familiar with the original narrative, then you should know the importance of the story told from Cloud's perspective, and how his internal battle against his sense of self, juxtaposed with his external battle with Sephiroth, is the most engaging part of this story and the original. And any moments in Rebirth that expand on that concept is great, but other party members get great time to shine too, like Barret's story regarding his origin and old friend Dyne, as well as Aerith's journey as the last living Cetra, with a duty to protect the planet and honor the hopes of her mother. I think the emotional moments of the story can be pretty impactful for the most part, but there's plenty of goofy and sincere moments too that I found to be incredibly entertaining, like the entire sequence at the Gold Saucer where most of the party members act out a play. I won't spoil much of it, but it's a genuine highlight that lets the voice actors chew up the scene with goofy, hammy dialogue that also manages to feel sweet and sincere. And I'll always love moments in RPGs where the party gets a chance to feel like more than just typical hero protagonists. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth has a lot of moving parts, and they all culminate really well when everything works together. So why is the video only halfway over? Well, I think one of the defining moments of the original game is the party leaving Midgar to enter the world for the first time. Even as a new player with no nostalgic attachment or expectations, I felt that sense of freedom and wonder stepping out into the overworld, so I can only imagine what that must have felt like back in 1997. That wonder into the unknown is what made the world exciting. Walking around, discovering what's ahead, unlocking methods of travel to new regions, even traveling underwater, it's so interesting. And unfortunately, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth doesn't capture that feeling of discovery and wonder that is so prevalent in the original game. The two just don't compare. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth suffers from what I think is commonly known as the Ubisoft open world syndrome. You're presented with an open, explorable area that is eventually littered with icons to go and check off, towers that uncover more icons, expedition missions where you look for treasure, combat trials, side missions, phenomenon missions, the list goes on. And eventually, completing these objectives feels like less of a discovery and more of just marking things off a checklist. Maybe I've been spoiled by the likes of games like Breath of the Wild and Elden Ring, where most of the journey is driven by player choice and motivation, but the contrast between this and the original game is noticeable. Final Fantasy VII always felt like it had a pretty natural sense of direction and progression, but Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, in its attempt to create such a giant game with so many things to do, struggles to provide a fun enough reason for why you should seek out and do these things. I was never particularly bored in completing most of the open world objectives, but my desire to complete them really came from just my desire to be thorough in my review of this game, and not necessarily because I was interested in doing these tasks. But this isn't even the largest issue with the open world and its design. The open world doesn't work hard enough to entice and motivate the player, but it's also detrimental to the narrative and pacing of the main story, and regularly clashes with it when it comes to the game's objective. My issue isn't with all the extra content, as stuff like bonus combat trials and minigames was never my problem, but for me, it's all about the context and framing. For example, when you first enter the Cosmo Canyon region, you're taken on a mostly linear path to the primary hub village for this area, Cosmo Canyon. After you progress a little of the main quest and narrative, completing a dungeon and whatnot, you're ready to leave Cosmo Canyon to move on to the next region. When I zoomed out of my map, I was shocked to find that 90% of the region map for Cosmo Canyon was still unexplored. For some players, they may see this as a positive, thinking about how they still have so much extra fun stuff to explore and do in this region. Call me a pessimist, but that's not how I saw it. For me, instead of finding a natural way to merge the linear narrative of Final Fantasy VII with the explorable open world, Square Enix instead just chooses to keep these two sides of Rebirth separate from one another. And the game suffers as a whole because it feels like each side of Rebirth had something that the other was missing. Whenever I was progressing the main narrative of Rebirth, I felt like I was missing out on the explorable and interesting world that the game had to offer. But on the other hand, whenever I was out doing the open world activities, enjoying the combat trials and the phenomenon missions that offered a nice change of pace, then I felt like I was missing out on progressing the narrative itself, which always had the most interesting developments for the characters. Because of Rebirth's approach to the open world design, on top of just adopting the tired strategy of littering the map with excessive icons, I never felt like this world worked with the story that was being told. It felt like a weight that was constantly on Rebirth's shoulders, holding it back from being a masterpiece. I don't want to keep making comparisons to something like Elden Ring, as it's really not fair. These are two entirely different games with different approaches to their world and exploration, but I think it's at least worth mentioning why I find Elden Ring's world much more compelling. Very little is told to you. The map only fills out and expands as you discover it, and much of the journey is motivated by you and you alone. Elden Ring's narrative is much more about environmental storytelling, so the formula here would never work with the Rebirth design. But I can't help but feel there are some lessons here that could have been used for Rebirth, and it's not just Elden Ring. I think that even the original Final Fantasy VII, with its excessive random battles and localization warts and all, had a more compelling approach to the world and discovery than Rebirth. Almost every secret or interesting extra content is found by you alone. There are so many discoveries I missed out on in the original because there wasn't some checklist for me to follow, and for me personally, that's far more interesting than Rebirth's approach. Granted, this was far more common back in the day for a lot of games, whereas today, I fear the work to making a game more approachable to as many people as possible can result in sanding down identity or charm. Keep in mind that there's a difference between being approachable and being accessible, at least in how I'm trying to describe it. I think games should strive to be as accessible as possible, without necessarily giving in to being approachable. And I think Elden Ring is a great example of not sacrificing intrigue or discovery for the sake of making the game feel more approachable. I would have loved to have seen something in Rebirth that would have merged the narrative main missions with some of the extra open world content. Maybe instead of having all the activity in a region focused on one very linear path, the game could have instead had a few of the main missions located throughout a region, thus forcing the player to eventually explore more of these regions and leading to a more natural discovery of extra content, rather than just seeking out Ubisoft towers. I don't think Rebirth needs to completely change its formula and design at all, but instead just reframe certain elements to better entice the player to discover the world in a more natural manner. At that point, once a player has spent more time exploring a region to progress the main quest, then it could be left up to them to pursue the extra content if they wanted to. I'm not here to explain what the devs should have done instead, or tell you what you should enjoy, but just spitballing and wondering what could have been done to better merge the story of Rebirth with the world. It brings to mind a wonderful video by Nakey Jakey discussing the struggle of Rockstar Games and their attempt to merge the open world discovery of Red Dead Redemption 2 with the linear, carefully curated experience. Both approaches are very valid for designing a game, but it's incredibly difficult to merge them together in a way that keeps me personally engaged. Go watch his video if you want. He dives much more into this issue than I ever could. On the topic of not telling the devs what to do, I'd actually like to retract that for one moment. There is something that I think the devs should 100% do for the next game in this remake trilogy.
Cloud!
The truest evil in Final Fantasy VII is not Shinra, the evil corporation draining the planet of her life. It's not Sephiroth, who wants to destroy the planet and become an all-powerful god. Or in the remake trilogy's case, become an all-powerful multi-timeline god. We'll get there later. No, it's this absolutely dreadful, loquacious motherfucker that sticks onto you even tighter than your own shadow. Remember what I said about the Ubisoft-style formula of the open world ruining the discovery? Much of that can firmly and harshly be blamed on fucking CHADLEY. CHADLEY. Even the name just fucking haunts me. Just speaking it makes me feel like I'm calling Candyman. CHADLEY interrupts so much of your open world exploration by simply telling you things you already know or telling you obvious shit that you were already going to find out. He is the epitome of every bad thing with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and I am not exaggerating. He's always there to interrupt your journey. He undermines any sense of discovery by beating you to the punch on nearly any surprise the open world throws at you. Hell, all of the extra side content and discovery, that's managed by him. That previously mentioned open world checklist, he wrote the fucking thing. I can't even properly emphasize how detrimental CHADLEY was to the experience of Rebirth in a way that no obnoxious AI companion or anything has felt in any other game. Navi? Ashley, that giant dog from The Last Guardian, they are absolutely nothing compared to the blood-sucking parasite that is CHADLEY. What started off as a seemingly innocuous shopkeeper in Remake has evolved into the ultimate ball and chain on the player's journey. Even just the sound of that fucking dumbass phone thing he calls you on just made my blood pressure rise. Don't be mistaken, this game does have a villain, and this is its true face. It doesn't even help that CHADLEY also thinks to design an AI companion named Mai, and not only do he and Mai get into weird little arguments that genuinely made me uncomfortable.
Your heroic victory over that vicious creature was a feast for the eyes.
I suppose it falls to me to make Mai's presence more tolerable.
How do you... Volume levels decreasing? Wait...
But of course, Mai has to be annoying too, since, and now bear with me here, I don't have any nostalgic attachment towards the original Final Fantasy VII. I played it only a few years ago, but what I do love about it is Nobuo Uematsu's soundtrack. It is catchy, punchy, hits all the right beats, and despite having never listened to it until I played the original, One Winged Angel is indeed a fucking masterpiece. I love the battle theme of the original. I think it's one of the best battle themes ever written for a game. Alright, still with me? So most of the time, you have original music for every region as the battle theme. It's cool, it's neat, and Uematsu's original track is primarily reserved for the side quest monster fights, right? Well, whenever you encounter one, get ready to not enjoy that song ever, because of fucking course Mai, who is built by CHADLEY, has to talk over the whole thing, just assaulting your eardrums with so much noise on top of noise that you feel like you're going insane. If Final Fantasy VII Rebirth had a form of waterboarding for your ears, it would be this right here.
No wonder that ancient peoples of this region revered it as a god, while the creature typically prefers to use its hunting ground.
You can avoid this by simply just letting her drone on until she's done, but of course your only solutions for this are to just mute your sound and miss out on the absolute glorious remake of that original battle theme, or just waste your time and wait for Mai to finally shut up. CHADLEY was actively detrimental to my enjoyment of the game because I was no longer exploring a world and discovering it of my own choice. I was this dipshit's errand boy, and I cannot emphasize enough how the framing and context for exploring and discovering this world is severely hampered by CHADLEY. The narrative and open world not mixing together, the lackluster design of the open world itself, relying on Ubisoft map icons. I don't know what the best solution is, but I gotta believe it could have been handled better than this. It's a shame that so many individual pieces of Rebirth are great, but but they sometimes feel like less than the sum of their parts. I think Rebirth's failure at merging the narrative and open world together, combined with the genuine frustration from CHADLEY removing any agency from the player, greatly hampers the world and journey of Rebirth. Before moving on, I'll give you a little spoiler warning here. I'm going to be diving into endgame stuff here, like the final boss, story's ending, and post-game content. If you want to be completely free of spoilers, then I recommend skipping to the timestamp. Ready? Despite referring to this fight as post-game content, I actually had completed it before the final boss, so I'll quickly touch on it here. Do you remember those Phenomenon missions? Well, they eventually lead to a special confrontation with Gilgamesh, the popular Final Fantasy series character. But before you can even fight him, you're presented with 3 special boss fights that must be completed first. By this point in the game, I was approaching the climax hovering around level 50, and these fights were stated to be at recommended level 65. I was dissuaded at first, and I gotta admit, it was pretty disappointing to discover that the resolution for this side quest that spanned the entire game now all of a sudden entails endgame level fights that most players likely won't complete on their first playthrough, and I imagine it could be even more frustrating for players who had to abandon completing this quest because of this difficulty. Thankfully, the fights are not nearly as impossible as they may seem at first. I was able to complete the first 2 without too much trouble, but the challenge of Odin and Alexander was incredibly tough. After hours of attempting to complete it, relying on Barret to tank damage, Odin's ultimate move would always wipe my team and I couldn't recover, nor could I successfully prevent Odin from activating the attack, not including Alexander's ultimate attack, which was no slouch. Eventually, and ironically enough, the saving grace for this fight was none other than my mortal enemy. Throughout the game, CHADLEY will develop special materia for every region you visit. You can think of these as your primary rewards for completing all the side content. Most of the materia is pretty neat, but not game-breaking, so I wouldn't consider it enough of a motivating factor towards completing all the regions, except for one. The location you confront Gilgamesh and the special summons is considered its own region, so beating at least one of the fights helped me to develop the most important materia I could find in the game, Re-Raise. This allowed me to preemptively prepare a party member to be revived the next time they fell in battle. This was crucial to defeating Odin and Alexander. Having a backup plan ready for the team wipe attacks made these fights actually possible to complete. After some struggle, it was time for Gilgamesh. The fight with Gilgamesh was a damn fun fight, but not too terribly challenging considering what came before. After Odin and Alexander, I was well prepared for this fight, so if you think to seek out this fight yourself, despite everything I said before, CHADLEY's usefulness here almost redeemed his image in my mind. Almost. Defeating Gilgamesh will unlock the option for some sweet endgame equipment and rewards, as well as unlocking special combat trials that are meant to be the toughest in the game, even including trials with playable Zack and Sephiroth. I didn't have a chance to check these out, but it's nice that Rebirth contains so many optional combat trials and challenges for those who seek them out. Moving on to the climax and the final boss, where we get a lot. The ending of this game more or less plays out like an expanded, padded ending to Disc 1 of the original game, as you would probably expect. You complete a very, very long dungeon at the Temple of the Ancients, following Sephiroth to the Forgotten Capital, all the way to that very moment, except we have a lot more of alternate timeline shenanigans sprinkled in between. Aerith is impaled, Cloud tries saving her, he succeeds, and then he doesn't. And at this point, I worry that FF7 Rebirth is going to be so preoccupied with surprising and confusing the player that it fails to embrace the biggest emotional gut punch of the original. But Jenova arrives, Sephiroth arrives, Zack is here, and this almost evolves into what feels like a fanfiction-made reality. Different timelines, different fights all happening at once, with a final boss fight that has 6 or 7 different phases. Everyone's attempting to stop Sephiroth from what he seems to be referring to as a new reunion. Not the Jenova reunion like in the original game, but rather a reunion of all the different worlds, different timelines of Final Fantasy VII into one world that he can have complete control over. Is that a lot to take in and kind of crazy? Yes. But I don't mind the excessiveness. In fact, I actually like what I think is happening, in that I believe most of the crazy excessive ending that doesn't make any sense can possibly be explained thanks to Cloud. He's an unreliable narrator, and he's falling apart. If you've played the original, you know that Cloud's mind is about to be completely fragmented by Sephiroth, and it'll be up to Tifa to guide him back to reality and help him figure out who he really is. And the ending of Rebirth sets up that next story thread. Cloud is seeing things the others can't. He seemingly hasn't fully accepted that Aerith is gone, and is ready to bring the black materia to Sephiroth, just like in the original. I really like the way FF7 Rebirth ends on paper, after having some time to think about it. Just like Remake, there are earth-shattering implications for what you just played, but the ending for both games more or less leaves things off exactly where you would expect. I think you can have your cake and eat it too, and I think Final Fantasy VII Rebirth tried to do that, but it unfortunately stumbles in one very important way, and maybe it's the biggest problem with the game. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is just too much. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and Remake, in trying to add so much extra depth and context and story, the more you add into the original, the more you lose or dilute what was already there to begin with. Extra optional stuff like challenges and minigames is okay, but when it starts affecting the narrative, storytelling, pacing, that's when problems start surfacing. Take for example Sephiroth. In the original game, you were introduced to and completely vanquished Sephiroth within 40 or so hours. He starts off as this legendary war hero, later turned into a deadly serial-killing ghost, blood in the Shinra building, his sword located firmly in President Shinra's back. Sephiroth is not only not a hero, but he's alive? You discover what he did at Nibelheim, how Cloud supposedly defeated him, but now he's back to torment Cloud. He kills Aerith right before Cloud's eyes. He's a constant looming presence that grows more twisted and terrifying as the game progresses, until you finally confront him and defeat him, with Cloud completely overcoming the Sephiroth that was in his head the whole game, messing with him, controlling him, and feeding him lies. Cloud defeats Sephiroth once and for all in a powerful moment of a victim, completely and unapologetically destroying his abuser. At least, that's how it came across to me. I mean, Sephiroth acts like a literal stalker. The idea of him being Cloud's abuser kind of makes perfect sense to me. Anyways, in Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth, because you've added so much extra content to that original story, you lose a lot of that close and personal relationship with Sephiroth. I think his appearances in the original game were paced perfectly and led him to being such an effective villain. Because of the extra length of Remake and Rebirth and how the events have to play out over a much longer period of time, Sephiroth feels like he shows up too much and not enough at the same time. For much of Rebirth's runtime, I had genuinely forgotten about him. You'll go for long stretches, nearly 5 to 10 hours, without even so much as a hint or inkling of his presence, because the games have now put themselves in a position where if they don't show him enough, then you'll forget the whole point of the story and what you're actually trying to do. But if they show him too much, then with every single reveal, they peel away at any potential mystery and threat he may possess. It's a really delicate balance to get right. In fact, it's arguably debatable as to whether or not the Sephiroth you encounter in this game is even supposed to be the same one as the original, given that this new remake Sephiroth seems to imply that he knows about the events of the original game and is trying to potentially rewrite history, or as he puts it,
Let us defy destiny together.
Does this sound like a lot? Well, it's because it is. In Remake and Rebirth's attempt to add so much more content to the original, you lose out on brevity. Sometimes a story's length is perfect for what it is, because the important elements, like the presence and appearance of the main villain, are so perfectly spaced out that any attempts to add or remove content could potentially result in a less interesting experience. And for me, Sephiroth is only interesting in Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth because of the work that the original did. I'd be surprised that someone playing these remakes for the first time without the context of the original would find Sephiroth to be a compelling villain. All he does is show up, confuse Cloud and the player, and spit out metaphorical rhetoric, even more so than he did in the original with the localization issues. Despite the fact that the remake trilogy is operating under the fact that you've played the original already, I don't think that excuses the fact that Sephiroth to me just feels much less interesting. Another gripe that I have that I think is really worth mentioning is how Final Fantasy VII Rebirth will sacrifice moments of tension or build-up because it's too eager to blow its load on explosions and the fucking time ghosts. This is going to be excessive nitpicking, but bear with me. In the original game, towards the end of Disc 1, just like the ending of this one, Cloud and the party will follow Aerith to the Forgotten Capital, and I will never forget the feeling I had when I first approached this area in the original and this song started playing. The name of this track is You Can Hear the Cry of the Planet, and it's incredible. It's otherworldly, haunting, and feels so different. You're discovering a land that is unlike anything Cloud and the gang have ever seen. Combined with the pre-rendered background that paints the Forgotten Capital as this mystical, underwater kingdom, frozen in time and lost to history, it's unbelievable, and the perfect setup to one of the most impactful moments in gaming history. I was very excited to see how this moment would play out ever since I first played Remake, because it was one of my favorite moments of the original. Well, here's what happens.
What is all this?
It's
Sephiroth arrives, like the remake trilogy itself, to a thunderous explosion, completely deflating any sense of tension or dread that was so masterfully crafted by the original. It's just noise. It's too much. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is just too much. Perhaps I was wrong to have expectations, but when you're remaking a game as legendary as Final Fantasy VII, you're naturally going to upset fans whenever you change anything. That's unavoidable. And it's okay for changes to be made if they're interesting in their own right, but it's also okay for fans to have certain expectations and to express disappointment. At the end of the day, it's called Final Fantasy VII. If you've played FF7, you have an idea what that might entail, and if the remake doesn't match that idea, I think it's fair to feel disappointed, but always important to try and remember that the remake games were never meant to replace the original, but almost act as a companion piece, a deluxe version that works alongside the original. With all that being said, I can't help but feel deflated when it feels like subtle brilliance is thrown away in favor of an epic nuclear showdown of good and evil. Maybe it's just me, but Sephiroth appearing in a giant time warp explosion is not nearly as interesting, since I've already seen it happen at the end of Remake, and earlier in this game too. And for me, that only eventually undermines Sephiroth once again, since his killing of Aerith is a little deflated, considering you just saw the guy like hanging right outside the building where he's gonna do it. Rebirth is of course operating under the fact that you know the original story, you know what's supposed to happen, but still, this just didn't sit right with me. Another moment that's always stood out to me in the original is the introduction of the final boss. You've accomplished this long gauntlet, climbing down the final dungeon, the Northern Crater, with some of the toughest enemies of the game. You've defeated Jenova for the third and final time. You've defeated Sephiroth in this hideous form, and he fades away into dust. Strange sound effects start playing. The music fades down. The screen turns to black. Then... I mean, that is just terrifying and powerful. I'll never get over the actual fear I had in that moment for a nearly 30-year-old game, because there's no extra dialogue, almost no build-up at all. You're thrown into the deep end. It's time to go. It's incredible. That lack of build-up is such a strength because of how the fight completely sucker punches you, and that subtlety and surprise is completely gone in Rebirth, and I fear will be missing in the final game too. I know I mentioned earlier about the Forgotten Capital and the strength of the build-up of that scene, and how opposite to that the final boss is so strong without any build-up, but I think it's all about context. It's all about knowing when to pace it, and right now, the way I see it, Final Fantasy VII's pacing when it comes to build-up and lack of build-up is handled much better than Remake and Rebirth. On the subject of the music, and how it's so brilliantly used in the finale of FF7, I gotta quickly mention one thing in Rebirth's case. I think I would have really appreciated less is more. While there's so much brand new music that I really loved in Rebirth, there's also a lot that just kind of fades into the background, and I think it's just due to the sheer number of the tracks in the game. For example, the overworld theme of the original is a classic, and you hear it so many times that it becomes ingrained in your skull by the time you complete the game. You see, of all the regions in the game, only about half of them use some variation of the original overworld theme. I love how Cosmo Canyon does it, for example, which makes it a more country remake using a fun beat and guitar, but it's still the overworld theme you recognize. Areas like Corel and Junon don't really succeed in this regard, and end up having more or less forgettable tracks. They're catchy, but they just didn't really stick with me. I love the Gungaga region's theme, but even then, I still miss hearing the old theme, and wonder what some combination of the current Gungaga theme would have sounded like remixed together with the original main theme. And this also circles back to the amazing battle theme and the original game's boss theme. These are such incredible tracks that unfortunately for me, don't feel like they get enough time to shine in this game, with a lot of the newer battle tracks being perfectly okay and some of them sounding great, but a lot of them to me are just not as memorable. I don't think it comes down to a lack of quality from these tracks, but arguably a lack of repetition. A great battle theme is nice to have, but if you only hear it a handful of times, you would just forget it, especially as it's drowned out by 20 other great battle themes. I feel like boss themes are typically an exception to this rule, but even now, I struggle to remember a lot of the boss themes in this game too. Maybe it's just me, your mileage may vary, but I found that the game could have scaled back on the amount of songs and figured out a way to creatively remix some of the classic Uematsu tunes. I mean, nostalgia aside, for me, so much of Final Fantasy VII's identity comes from the legendary soundtrack. To not have an accurate and faithful rendition of You Can Hear the Cry of the Planet, that just really bums me out. Remake and Rebirth do some fun little remixes using the melody, but there's no theme that feels like it truly honors that original song. Maybe I'll get lucky for the third game in the trilogy. I'll talk about this next part very briefly, but I have to say that if you had some kind of expectation for where Zack's story would go and what kind of narrative implications it may have, I'm sorry to say that I think you'll be left disappointed. You see this cover art right here? Well, I'll tell you right now that the only reason of Zack's inclusion here is because of his role in the final battle against Bizarro Sephiroth, or as he's referred to in this game, Sephiroth Reborn. Zack is seemingly plucked right from whatever new timeline he's inhabiting to face off against Sephiroth alongside Cloud, and then he's dropped right back off like nothing happened. I was hoping there would be some kind of narrative or emotional reason for this new timeline featuring a living Zack. Would he potentially right some wrong, or have a moment with Aerith and Cloud, or face off and try and stop Sephiroth on his own? It's very clear by the end of this game that Zack's story still has to be played out, but it feels like Rebirth doesn't really do anything to progress it in a meaningful way. Zack's story just felt like a setup for the introduction of the idea of multiple timelines and worlds reuniting at the end of this game, and I imagine that something like that will happen at the end of whatever the final remake game is, but I'm just left asking, will I even care at this point? I know where the story is headed. I like how Rebirth's story ended, on a note more or less in line with the original. But the thing is, with Rebirth's ending featuring multiple timelines all converging in an epic battle for good and evil, featuring Cloud and Zack and even Aerith facing off against Sephiroth, what could Square Enix possibly do for the third game that would even be shocking or impressive at this point? It almost feels like they blew their load too early. I have no idea where they could possibly end the final game, since I cannot at all picture it getting any crazier without devolving into some psychotic Avengers Endgame level finale, where different Clouds from different dimensions and timelines all team up to defeat Sephiroth across every timeline once and for all, but that just sounds like borderline parody. God, I really hope I'm wrong about that. At the end of it all, at the edge of creation, after completing Rebirth, I just can't help but wonder, was this truly the best direction to take this remake in? I mean, at the very least, it makes for a fascinating conversation, and does set an interesting standard for what a video game remake could be. And don't get me wrong, I quite enjoyed all the crazy spectacle of the final fight, the different phases, the great challenge. I played through the entire game in dynamic difficulty and felt like it was tuned pretty perfectly. But at the end of it, when Cloud and the gang fly off in the Bronco with Aerith watching, I can't help but think to myself how that moment in Rebirth, the moment, Aerith's death, felt so... What could have been a new take on one of the most infamous scenes in all of video games just wound up feeling deflated because of the confusing framing and pacing of it. I like the idea of showing Cloud potentially saving Aerith and still failing, or even just outright saving her and changing the course of the story, but the way Rebirth does it feels so deceptive. When she was dead and that moment was happening, the music kicking in, the white materia bouncing just like the original, I felt nothing. Because I was left so confused and unconvinced that what I was seeing was actually happening. Between timeline shenanigans and Cloud as an unreliable narrator, how could I be convinced of what was happening? And when the player themselves isn't even sure that this important character death is actually happening or not, then how could they be expected to feel any sincere emotion? I like the ending of Remake, and even though it was crazy, I like the implications and mystery that was set up. But Rebirth, and what I guess was its attempt to one-up Remake in the crazy factor, lost sight of the emotional impact and intent of this scene in the original. If you want to have your crazy time ghosts and explosions and hour-long final boss fight, I'm all for it. But maybe learn to take a step back and let your quiet moments, your tension, your sadness, your heartbreak, just give it room to breathe. Was this remake truly the right direction to go in, when it results in undermining the greatest emotional impact in Final Fantasy VII by confusing the player with multiple timelines and events, all on top of Cloud as an unreliable narrator to begin with? Was it really worth sacrificing elements like brevity, tension, and Sephiroth as a compelling villain, just so we can have an extra story beat in the game involving Johnny, everyone's favorite Final Fantasy character?
Hot, steamy showers in every room!
I remember seeing an article from Square Enix talking about how a remake of Final Fantasy VI, or maybe it was Final Fantasy IX, one of them, in the same style as FF7 would take 20 years to develop. But I'm just left to ask, why? Why does it have to be in the same style as the FF7 remake? I loved a lot of things about Rebirth. I think it's superior to Remake, and could easily recommend it to anyone who's played the original game and Remake. But even so, I still can't help but wonder, could we not have potentially been able to shrink the remakes into 2 games, and keeping Midgar a relatively small but slow start to the adventure? Even fans of Final Fantasy VII Remake will admit that the game felt padded out, and for me, that same criticism extends to Rebirth. There are sections of the game, even in the main narrative, that still felt stretched out and padded to cover more ground and extend the runtime. I'm specifically thinking of Red 13's trial at Cosmo Canyon, Kate Sith's journey into Shinra Manor, and the final dungeon leading up to the final boss, all of which felt like they greatly overstayed their welcome. Maybe the final game of the Remake Trilogy will finally put things into perspective. I think from the gameplay and mechanical side of things, the developers have great judgment and are on a roll. Combat and a lot of the extra content feel mostly great, but the framing and context between the different elements of the game still needs improvement, and I'd love for some extra care to be put into knowing when to let the story and characters breathe, and when to run wild with the crazy Remake Time Ghost shenanigans. I do think there's room for both. Chadley should be taken out back and shot dead, never to return. Send him and Mai to hell right next to Jesse. No! No! There's a lot of ground to cover in the plot, but when it comes to exploring new areas of the original world's map, most of the world has already been uncovered in Rebirth. Will we be revisiting old recycled areas in the 3rd game? Will Zack's story receive a satisfying solution? And will it be possible to create a grand solution that lives up to the original while laying its own foundation? Or will this 3rd and final game leave me wishing for an alternate timeline, an alternate world, where Final Fantasy VII's Remake was completely toned down in scale to more closely resemble the feeling and tone of the original? I wish I could say, but believe, know that you'll find me there waiting for the reunion.